So we'll broadcast now. So good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening. I say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening because we have people in many different time zones, not only from Estonia. My name is Meelis Kitsing, and I'm a head of Foresight Center's research team. And what I am going to do today is that I'm going to introduce our speakers. But before that, let me just say a few words about why do we discuss global balance of power? Why is it important for us at the Foresight Center? Namely, we launched a project on the global balance of power and its shifts and what it means for Estonia in the beginning of this year. And obviously, this new crisis, a new pandemic in the world has a huge impact on that as well. And so on one hand, from the very beginning, it was clear for us that if you're sort of thinking about the global balance of power, then we have to do it in the terms of scenarios, particularly in sort of 15 years ahead and so on, because it's kind of difficult to offer only one vision, because there are so many competing understandings what might happen in the next 15 years. And by reviewing some of the work that other Foresight teams around the globe have done, we came to sort of conclusion that there are at least three different views. There are some scenarios that sort of emphasize global cooperation. There are some scenarios who are more focused on emergence of regional blocs and sort of scattered geopolitics. And then there are scenarios that sort of emphasize more sort of loose network type of global system where states have lost their legitimacy. And you have lots of different actors, private actors, community actors, and others that become increasingly important. But now, as the COVID-19 is around us and has a damaging impact on the world and economy and lives of the people, then all those trends are emerging in a somewhat different light. And this is something that we would like to sort of tackle here in this webinar. So without further ado, let me say a few words about our panelists. So we are very happy to have such a sort of distinguished panel. First, we have Dr. Parag Khanna, who's joining us from Singapore. Parag Khanna is a CEO and founder of FutureMap. And he has published many books on global balance of power and other sort of global developments. And he holds a PhD from London School of Economics. Then we have Dr. Risto Penttila, who's joining us from Finland. He's CEO of Nordic West office. He also has run several business organizations in Finland and Europe. He's graduate of Oxford University, and where he earned his PhD. And Risto also has been a long time ago member of Finnish Parliament. Then let me turn to our third panelist, Merle Maigre. Merle is currently a vice president of Cybexer Technologies, which is Estonian cybersecurity firm. Merle has been advisor to President Kersti Kaljulaid and also President Toomas Hendrik Ilves. Merle also has worked at the NATO's headquarters and also hold many other positions in Estonian Defense Ministry and other organizations. And our fourth panelist is Andres Sutt. Andres is a member of Estonian Parliament, but previously He has been a deputy governor at the central bank. He also has worked at the International Monetary Fund and also in the organizations like European Stability Mechanism that were set up in response to the previous crisis. So he brings at least 25 years of finance and banking experience to this debate. So the way we will go ahead is that first I will give an opportunity to Parag to talk about his take on where we are heading in the world, how the global balance of power will shift. And without further ado, Parag, floor is yours, and I will put up some slides here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted. Tere, everyone. I think you are obviously one of the few individuals and collectives of people working in this domain who are willing to look further than 1 week ahead. and I applaud you for that. Actually, those of us who've worked in various corners of the scenarios community, including the National Intelligence Council in the US, have admired Baltic countries in general and Estonia in particular for this capacity to think and act in a long-term way. So thank you again. Let me be very brief because I know we want to get through each presentation and also have a discussion. So let me just provide a few thoughts around where I see some of the pre-pandemic trends potentially deepening. If we can just go to the first slide, the next slide.
This is correct one?
Yes, exactly, right. So here I wanted to emphasize that prior to the pandemic, we were moving into a world of regional divergence. That is not the same as deglobalization per se. It's that the depth of regionalism is accelerating at a rate faster than certain dimensions of globalization. If you look at North America, because of the trade war, the US is trading more with Canada and more with Mexico each than with China. Now you have an additional push for nearshoring of strategic industries, medical devices, and other sorts of things, and so on. So you do have a self-sufficiency in North America. Europe, of course, has had mostly internal trade, though, of course, it's still also very globally connected. Asia, few people know this because when we think of Asia, we tend to think of an export-dependent region, but it's mostly internally export-dependent. Most trade of Asia is within the region as well, much like other regions. So you have this tri-polarity in the world economy. You also have some efforts at deepening, obviously, going on. Again, as I mentioned, the USMCA was the North American trade agreement that is helping the sort of new NAFTA. You have obviously the efforts to move from a fiscal union to a monetary union. In Europe, that's obviously playing out every single day. And in Asia, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was agreed last year. And if that moves ahead, that will add another $200 billion to internal trade. All of the stimulus measures that governments are undertaking right now are not directed at propping up the global economy. There is obviously some spillage, some leakovers, some ways in which there is reinforcing. But these are simultaneous and coordinated, but not necessarily global measures. The purpose of each country's stimulus right now is to mostly shore up the domestic economy, right? So we're moving more and more again into this trifurcated system. Can we go to the next slide? So here, let's talk about the role of China. Now, the second issue to deal with first is, this sort of trend towards dispersion or diffusion among the three major geopolitical centers of the world. Now we can look a little bit more specifically at Asia and Eurasia, and specifically the role of China. So my view clearly is that we do not live in a G2 world of the US and China. We do not live in a world where China will be number one and replace the United States. I'm looking at much more complex kinds of interactions. So if we look at China, some people are asking, will the new health Silk Road and be the pathway by which China deepens It's a quest for global dominance. Will Belt and Road expand? Will China take advantage of weaker economies and initiate further debt traps? I don't think those are really going to happen. If you live in Asia, then you don't really pay much attention to Chinese propaganda about their health Silk Road. Most of the human population lives on the map that you see on the bottom right. So most of the human population is Asians. Most humans, therefore, are either border China or are not that far away from the Chinese border. And every single one of us, I include myself because I live on the bottom of that map right in the center in Singapore, every one of us knows where the virus came from. No amount of Twitter propaganda from Chinese diplomats or retweeting of that propaganda by Italians or Brazilians will really be useful here. So the suspicion of China that was already incredibly high prior to the pandemic because of Belt and Road and debt trap diplomacy and aggression in the South China Sea, all of that is at a fever pitch now. So even as China reallocates capital mostly towards its periphery, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and so forth, it's going to be taken, either rejected or taken with a great deal of caution. So my view of Asia is therefore that it will move further and further towards multipolarity, in which you really have this infrastructure arms race of multiple competitors seeking to dilute Chinese influence in building and financing connectivity around the region. And that's not just infrastructure, but also military, because you can see that before the pandemic, this quad relationship between the United States, Japan, India, and Australia was strengthening, not only to patrol the Indo-Pacific waters, but also to strengthen the capacity of littoral states in the South China Sea, such as the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, to stand up for their own interests in those waters. Next slide, please. So far we have a global multipolarity of regions, and within Asia, we have a multipolarity within Asia. And that is the historical norm for the last 4,000 years. Only once has an empire actually managed to dominate the majority of the Asian territory for a sustained period of time. And that was the Mongols more than 700 years ago. I don't think it's the most relevant analogy for today. Also, what's happening today, again, as I said, is this multi-alignment. The more developing countries, emerging markets, former Soviet republics, leverage Chinese investment. Some of them, the smallest ones, may fall into these so-called debt traps. The larger ones have been using multi-directional investment to actually grow, to pay down debts, to expand their economies, and therefore to become more attractive to global capital markets so that they become less dependent on China. You also have to factor in the rise of India, the growing reach of Japan, and so forth, again, to mitigate Chinese dominance. So because my bottom line on this is that mostly when we look at China, we focus on their actions in a linear way and project China getting what it wants. The truth is that historically, most empires don't get what they want. And that will be especially true in Asia, because in Asia, most people and most governments have a memory of European colonialism and of the Cold War. So many, many leaders are alive today in Asia. Asia is not like, like Estonia, where 30-year-olds are prime ministers, right? So in Asia, you have plenty of people who are very old, who remember British colonialism, who remember the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And the last thing they want is to repeat history for the third time in their lifetimes and be subjugated to Chinese neocolonialism. So there's a very strong awareness, and the backlash against China is more important than what China does. And the truth is that in strategic studies, we tend to ascribe almost zero agency to anyone other than China. And that's a humongous mistake. So next slide, please. Final couple of points. Here, Europe is really pivotal. Europe is almost a swing region, you might say. The idea of the West, a unified strategic West embodied in NATO, the transatlantic economic relationship, a community of values, is a very 1990s kind of nostalgia. If you think about the last 20 years since the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so forth, we've seen a clear drift. And now what's happened along the way is the fundamental geoeconomics have also shifted. Europe trades more with Asia than it does with North America. And as these Belt and Road trade corridors expand, even though Europe seeks greater reciprocity and is being tougher on China, it has a free trade agreement with Korea, a free trade agreement with Japan. It wants to have a similar one with ASEAN and one with India. So if you look on the right-hand side, the number 1.6 trillion, this 1.6 trillion could become 2 trillion, 2.5 trillion, who knows, in the coming decade. Whereas, as you know, the transatlantic trade relationship is more or less stagnated. So this Eurasian axis is really the key economic axis of the world, both in terms of GDP, trade dependency, and trade volume, and is the only one of these three arrows or vectors that is likely to grow significantly in the years ahead. You could actually imagine trans-Pacific trade declining, but you cannot imagine trans-Eurasian trade declining by any means. So Europe plays this role where strategically it still is part of a Western security community, but in terms of economic standpoint, it votes with its wallet and has joined some countries like Italy have joined the Belt and Road. Many European countries have joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and so forth. In my mind, despite the tensions in Eurasia and across Eurasia, it is most definitely still the geoeconomic and strategic domain of greatest importance in the world. Next slide. And so what is actually happening more broadly is this recreation of what historians call Afro-Eurasia. And this is not a term I was familiar with until I was writing this latest book, The Future is Asian, but historians of the pre-colonial world describe the combination of the terrestrial trade routes and the Indian Ocean trade routes as the Afro-Eurasian system. So as the word suggests, it contains Africa, Europe, and Asia. And what's basically being recreated today is Afro-Eurasia. Now, of course, this was a time, again, the pre-colonial world, pre-discovery, of the Atlantic, of the Western Hemispheric, continents, and therefore this was the world in many ways. And on this map, you have the vast majority of the human population in the world economy is here on this slide, right here. And more or less every region has an interest in benefiting from the economic complementarities. Now, as in the 15th century, China was not dominant in this picture. This was a multipolar world as well. And I think, again, Afro-Eurasia will revive or be resurrected as a multipolar system. Next slide. And so what you get ultimately is a world, as I said at the beginning, that's not a G1, it's not a G2, it's not a unipolar order, it's not a hegemonic transition. It's something fundamentally different from what we have ever seen in history, because we've really never lived in a global system in which every continent, every region was a simultaneous, sovereign, self-determined participant. We've only had colonial and imperial orders and hegemonic Cold War order. We've never really had a distributed, fully participating global system in which no power can dictate to the others who they can and cannot form relationships with that relate to trade, investment, even military ties, or culture. And that is actually the world we live in today. Each region has core and peripheral powers. Some are obviously more important than others. That is most certainly the case. However, at the same time, there isn't really one that stands at the center and determines the sort of shape of the system. In a way, this is the shape. It shapes itself. And that's what entropy means, is this continuous devolution of power in many ways. So to me, it's not a hierarchical world. It's more sort of symmetrical, as some say. Regionalism matters more than global hierarchy. And you have a competition to be the leading utility provider in a way. And the utilities, the global goods, are security, infrastructure, energy, governance, finance, technology. And the United States is not the only power that provides these. It's a marketplace of competition. That's what I call the geopolitical marketplace, or the geoeconomic or geotechnological marketplace. And states large and small can be important players and vendors in this marketplace. So that's the way I see the sort of world order evolving. And much of it, quite frankly, is pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. In most of these trends will only be accelerated by the pandemic, but that's the part obviously that remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Parag, for this great introduction. And now I would like to give a floor to Risto Pentila, and Risto also will share slides. Risto, floor is yours.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Thanks very much, Melis, and thank you, Parag. That was wonderful. I especially like the concept geopolitical marketplace. It describes your vision very well. What I'm going to do is go through an example of how scenarios have been used by leading Nordic, mainly Finnish companies over the past 2.5 years, 3 years, and how these same companies are using them to map out the post-corona world. And so this is actually an example of scenarios in practice. And I'm going to run through this, and I emphasize that these are currently being used. So any comments you may have are going to be also used with the companies that we work with, but hopefully that won't stop you from making very good comments. So let's start from the beginning. 2.5 years ago, we had 16 companies, went around the world for about 9 months, talked to 70 experts, and came up with 4 different scenarios for the world. Belt and Road is a China-led world. Cyber world in the right upper hand corner is a technology-driven world. Both of these are worlds where globalization goes forward. And then we have war, which is a world of trade wars and technology wars. And then we have a place called Downshift. Now we described the path that would take us to these different worlds, and it was very easy to describe the paths for 3 of those worlds. But one of them, the one that we called Downshift, we couldn't think of a way to get there. So we just wrote an unpredictable global crisis leads to zero growth for a long period of time. And then we've been mapping the projection as to where the world is going over the past 2.5 years. And then we came from a China-led world to a world of war, that is trade wars. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves in Downshift scenario. And this is what the team wrote about this Downshift scenario more than 2 years ago. It's a place where values have changed. Economic growth is no longer the top priority. Other values are more important. It's good news for climate, but it's bad news for everyone else. The last point here, public debt skyrockets, social security and healthcare systems break down, is the reason why everyone agreed that this would be a short-lasting world, a scenario that could not last for a long time. However, since we finished these scenarios, there's been a lot of talk of modern monetary theory, which basically says deficits don't matter. And this is exactly where we are now. All of the world's governments have basically become, at least for time being, practitioners of modern monetary theory. And that, of course, makes it possible to finance this situation for a bit longer. Now, nevertheless, at some point we are going to start coming back from the crisis, and what we've done is basically take the 3 commonly used scenarios for recovery and see how they play out in our 4 scenarios. So here we are, recovery scenario number 1. Sharp V, and this is a rapid recovery where we would see China restarting already in April, US starts later, but its recovery would be more robust than expected. And this scenario would see a very robust growth in the latter part of 2020. Second wave of the pandemic would be contained, and 21 would be a good year for the world economy. This scenario would see President Trump re-elected. Now there's the second commonly described recovery scenario, the U scenario, delayed recovery, where central banks are powerless in terms of restarting the economy. They can help prevent further crises, but in this scenario, recovery doesn't start before the beginning of next year. And this is a scenario where Europe is very much split politically. Italy is on the brink, and Joe Biden is elected according to this logic of this scenario as president. Now, the third scenario, of course, is the perfect storm. If the first was the good and the second one the bad, then this is the ugly scenario. Many different crises at the same time. This is worse than the global financial crisis and uglier than the Great Depression. And of course, in real life, President Biden would move very much to the left in this scenario. Now, out of this, we've developed a baseline scenario already 4 weeks ago, and this is the Nike Swoosh scenario that we still think that is likely to happen. And the Nike Swoosh scenario basically says that peak corona happens in April in Europe. The Bundesliga starts in May. Global growth kicks in the third quarter. We go one step forward, another step back. Basically, we will see strong growth next year, and full recovery will have to wait until 22. And this would lead to a very tight fight between Trump and Biden in the presidential elections. Now, this is all fine, and this is something that we see in the press discussed all the time. What we are trying to do with our clients is to see how they play out in these different scenarios that I started with. And basically the question is, who wins? And our view is that in the Belt and Road scenario, where China would start its growth first, and if everything goes to plan, then the US would follow, Europe perhaps would be the slowest to restart, then this would very much play into the hands of China coming out of this scenario stronger. The V scenario would be good news for American business and American companies. It would not be a world where the US would be a political leader, but it would be very much like the 1990s, where global corporations would take the lead. The U scenario would mean bad news for the European Union, and would see the strengthening of the nation state. And the downshift scenario would basically be bad news for everyone around. And in terms of sort of values have changed, it would lead to very radically different lifestyles and communities than what we have seen in the past. So this is a way we try and use scenarios that were created already 2.5 years ago as a framework for thinking through the crisis and developing a vision where the world might be heading. And I'll just finish with sort of an overview of our thinking in terms of not just coming out of the crisis, but say the next 3 to 8 years, what might be happening in these different scenarios. Scenario that's called Belt and Road would see China taking America's place. Europe would be relatively strong. America would be sidelined. cyber world would be very much a world where the US would still be the leading capitalist power because of the power of its private sector. In this scenario, the UK would probably come out quite well, since the European Union would be in quite a difficult place in this scenario. It would be more a community, an economic community than a political community. The war scenario, in terms of our recovery thinking, would be very bad news for the European Union. Indeed, would be very difficult to see any way for the euro to survive in this world where the nation state would come back. And indeed, of course, we have seen the return of the nation state already. And in this scenario, it would maintain its position as the strongest actor on the global scale. And then the downshift scenario, as I mentioned, would very much be bad news for all around. So that's an example of how we try and work with global scenarios. And I think I'll just finish here and go forward to hearing everyone else's comments. Thank you very much indeed. So.
All right, thank you very much, Risto, for showing us how you and Finnish business community is thinking about use of scenarios, particularly in this sort of very uncertain situation that we are in. But now I would like to give an opportunity for Merle to reflect on Parag's and Risto's presentation. And Merle, particularly from the perspective of sort of security issues, as they are actually very, for security perspective, as this is very important for us. So it's not just about economic developments, but what are also the implications from the security perspective, particularly in this region, Central and Eastern Europe. So Merle, please, floor is yours, so to say.
Well, ladies, thank you very much. And on my side also, it's great to be in such an honorable crowd to be speaking about looking at the future. Thanks for the Foresight Center to include me in this selection. And indeed, I try to look at security, but I must admit in the current economic crisis there, but I limit my comments and leave room for the discussion. So indeed, I think, well, it's obvious we are going through a crisis, so it's natural to assume that this will be history. I think COVID-19 will not so much change the global balance of power as accelerated. I see the pandemic as a catalyst that amplifies several long-term trends. So I will try to offer on my side some reflections about some of the aspects that were covered by Parag and Risto, the geopolitics and some of the actors from the perspective of the security policy in the Central Eastern European context. One thing is clear, this great virus certainly tests, I believe, transatlantic relations. It tests the return of the big government and the role of the nation states and the significance of European solidarity as national border barriers go up. So first, for the Central and Eastern European defense and security, the role of the US and transatlantic relations has always been really significant. But what we see in the current crisis really is marked by a lack of US leadership. The United States have not rallied the world in any collective effort to confront either the virus or its economic effects. Small stories to illustrate it from the military and defense security perspective. In early land force at a conference in Germany to discuss the execution of one of the largest and most important exercises this year, Defender Europe. Defender Europe would have involved the deployment of a division-size combat credible force from the US to Europe. This exercise was designed to improve NATO's ability to deter and defend against Russian aggression, and it had a specific role in enhancing NATO's military mobility. Upon return home from that meeting of military leaders in Germany, the commander of Polish armed forces, General Jarosław Mika, was diagnosed with coronavirus, the Polish Ministry of Defense said. So that was the beginning of bad news. By now, the whole exercise Defender Europe has been cancelled. All movement of personnel and equipment from US to Europe has ceased. The context, which I believe lends significance to the now cancelled military exercise, is inevitably various statements of US President Donald Trump's seeking to demonstrate to his voters toughness, anti-cosmopolitanism, and nationalism. Back in 2016, Trump's Make America Great Again campaign followed that script. In 2020, he's blaming of China for the coronavirus, his polarization, the banning travel from Europe, the attempt to block international trade of medical equipment, and his continued anti-NATO rhetoric are clearly evidence of the same appeal, us against them sentiment, with Americans as victims of foreigners. In doing so, Trump seems to be appealing to deep-seated nationalist sentiment long held by his core supporters. Trump's base will probably be therefore receptive to even more criticism of NATO's nations not paying enough for their own defense. And as a result, in the end, in November 2020, when we see the US presidential elections coming up, we will probably see the US further turning inward. And this is not good news for the Central Eastern European security and defense perspective. Or as Carl Bildt, the former Swedish Prime Minister, tweeted back in April, this is the first great crisis in the post-American world. The UN Security Council is nowhere to be seen. G20 is in the hands of a crown prince from Saudi Arabia, and the White House has trumpeted America first for everyone and everyone alone for years. Only the virus is globalized. Coming to my second point, the virus forces the return of big government, and the role of nation state is clearly visible. Something that was predicted after the collapse of the Lehman Brothers, but didn't happen then. In itself, concept is nothing new. Following the Great Depression in 1929, for example, it demanded strong government intervention to offset the failing. In 1970s, it was the other way around. People were disappointed with government intervention and started to believe in the market. Now the virus brings the government back in a big way. Already, we see the response to the pandemic has seen the democratic leaders across Europe assume powers unprecedented outside wartime. And in Central and Eastern European, the governments are tempted to increase their powers and to restrict civil rights almost to a dangerous degree. I think the ways out of the crisis will present liberal democracies a choice between heavy-handed nationalism on one side and an open global order founded on cooperation between states on the other hand. One area where this choice is particularly visible is an approach taken towards foreign investors looking at broken companies in the pandemic-induced economic environment. In this light, it would make sense to review rules of foreign investment in critical technologies, in infrastructure, and sensitive personal data. The question is whether Central Eastern European nations will do it, whether they will do it alone, or whether they prefer to come together and come up with some sort of European guidelines on what foreign investors can and purchase. Further on, this will show the relationship between the Central Eastern European countries and China, as most probably Chinese investment is most likely to approach that part of the world. For example, in Australia, which is a target of much Chinese investment in recent years, plans to review all its foreign investment to protect national interests. So we will see whether China will have more opportunities to help Europe and particularly Central Eastern Europe. We will be able to see what will be the future of the 5G and telecommunications networks in the Central Eastern European region, which has definitely clearly implications on the security sphere. Finally, my third point deals around the role of Europe, which is particularly relevant for the EU members of Central Eastern European countries. Can EU become stronger after the coronavirus? And what indications does the crisis offer for Europe's capacity to build its security and defense capabilities? The EU's initial response has been haphazard, with national governments taking the center stage, and we've seen, as Risto pointed out, ourselves very much in the war scenario. But EU can be pretty good at designing the sort of big programs which post-virus economic recovery will call for. The saving grace for the challenge at EU level is that all member states are in this together, unlike during the financial crisis or in the migration wave back in 2015. Managing this economic fallout will be the real test of EU's cohesion, but I will not get more into it. I would just say that I think while some Central Eastern European national governments are likely to be tempted to embrace even more popularity following the crisis, deeper truth is that nation-driven solutions are more likely to fail to rise to the challenges imposed by the pandemic. So summing up, it is important to remember that coronavirus is neither the end of the world nor the end of the history. The world will certainly change, but geopolitics is not likely to fall victim to a virus. And just as Parag pointed out, geopolitics and geopolitical marketplace is something that remains. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Merle. And now I will give opportunity to Andres Sutt, who can also reflect on Merle's points and also Risto's and Parag's points from a perspective of economic policymaker, where you have sort of, as I mentioned before, a long career from different organizations and now from the Finance Committee of Estonian Parliament. So please, Andres, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Meelis, and hello to everyone. This has been really fascinating three presentations, at least from my perspective. And I would start with one positive note, which our event really confirms. But the world continues to be a small place and connected. I think without the coronavirus, we were probably being massively struggling to find a spot in our calendars to come physically together. And that part, I think, has certainly changed. Now, this crisis has been really a big one, or is a big one. And I was just thinking that in many respects, we have been prepared or trained to be prepared for a financial crisis. Has happened many times in the past. Well, has always been difficult, always been some learning curve, but at least this has been something that we experienced and survived. And I think the same goes by and large to the military domain, that there is permanent military exercises, drilling, so that people know how to act if things happen. But once it comes to pandemic, it seems that everybody was completely unprepared. And the fallout is correspondingly massive. So I have 4 points. The first, and that is sort of what about this crisis? It's certainly the greatest since the Great Depression, at least numerically, and that I think also determines a bit how we are getting out of it. And then I will actually continue where what also Merle mentioned. Is it something now that the world will be completely different after the crisis, or is it more something that will that the crisis is accelerating already existing trends? And my own inclination is to the latter, because if one looks at the waning American leadership, less multilateral cooperation, which is also missing a global response to this crisis, and there has been very little cross-border global coordination. And thirdly, what is called great power discord. I mean, trade tensions, political fragmentations have been in place for quite a while. And I think this crisis sort of accelerates the pace. And if we look really back in history, if we go a bit further, starting from Pax Britannica back in second half of 19th century, which was the first kind of a big era of globalization led by Britain, and then closer to the First World War, and between the wars, clearly the downhill, and then the Pax Americana following after the Second World War. So there was always a kind of opening and promotion of multilateralism and more global business and cooperation. And now, if we are, and that is interesting what Parag said, and that's why I think it's incredibly important to listen to people from the region and also listen to outside-in views, because sort of my sense from the distance has been that there is a very, very strong Chinese dominance in the Asian region. But what you, Parag, said is actually not necessarily confirming that view. So maybe we are not with Pax Casino yet, but at least they themselves have a big ambition to become dominant by 2049 in terms of military, economy, politics, and technology. So that I think is an interesting dimension. Now, my second point, what about the pace of recovery? And this is what I think Risto made a very good list of options. And I think you have everything where the question is which out of the four, or which combination of the four we may eventually end up to. And as this crisis really is deep, and again, I think the second, and relatedly, I mean, we are in the middle of a storm of the eye, basically. I mean, it just began, and I think it's really, really difficult to get a good sense which direction we are moving, and every day maybe seems like eternity. So that's why I think it's kind of difficult to call now. But I personally tend to see it as a slow recovery, at least in the beginning, because a few points. First, there is a massive debt what has been built up after the financial crisis across the world. It's not only in the government books, but also in the private sector. To get now a quick acceleration with that debt level, I think needs more debt, but obviously any incrementally added dollar gives you incrementally less in terms of a GDP growth. So that I think is going to be difficult. And even though the interest rates are at zero, and that I think is also important for both companies and the government. I mean, for as long as debt is basically interest-free, it's always sustainable. It's like a perpetual. But once the interest rates will rise, you have a massive impact in the books. And of course, if a world debt is somewhere north of 3 times of the world GDP, I mean, it's a huge number, and it's 40% higher than it was in 2008. If we look at the government deficits, I mean, they are double-digit not everywhere, but in most of advanced economies this year. So, and that will further add to the debt pile. So again, it is okay, and sustainable for as long as rates stay low. For how long they stay low is a question mark. A second point is unemployment. We are seeing a massive increase in unemployment again across the board, and I'm afraid that the uptick in employment is not going to be that fast, because people are not. I mean, the crisis has its impact, and it takes time. So that's why I think it could well take a while. Because even if you look at the US, I mean, 30 million people soon unemployed. It's a 20% unemployment rate, or equivalent to the whole population of the state of Texas. So that's actually quite a bit. When, of course, money is going to be there, that I'm also pretty confident that central banks have committed to put a lot of trillions on the marketplace, buying not only government debt but also private debt. Is it good or bad? That I think is a big question. Then I think there is also quite a bit of a drive to nationalism and protectionism on many fronts. I mean, there was just recently news about Russia putting limits on the grain exports. And I very much agree with Merle that we are likely to see much more state capitalism in the world, as it used to be the case. Again, what is the outcome of it, how it will impact the productivity, globalization, and I think it was very good point what Parag made. Are we sort of moving away from globalization to regionalization? And in a way, I do agree that if also looking at the demographics, Afro-Eurasia is certainly the region where is the highest potential for trade and also movement of people. But how it will materialize, again, a very tricky question. So, and I think there is also at least some movement towards self-sufficiency, which sort of again is going to be a negative drag on efficiency, because it has an impact on the global value chains, and some things will certainly change. And now, what we should do in ideal world, and that's my third point, it would be really good again to reopen societies for business, travel, and study. How and when it will happen is really a question of many factors. And I would be personally very pleased to see Nike Swoosh scenario to materialize, but somehow I'm a bit reluctant to put my bet on it. And again, I think we saw how disruptive the re-emergence of borders is. So what we experienced in Europe for a short while, and also for commerce, the trade or borders were closed. It was kilometers long truck lanes at the borders. And this is certainly something which I think was quickly realized, that at least the trade needs to flow, because otherwise we are getting very much into difficulty. On the long term, I think the climate issues will still remain. I don't think the corona crisis will somehow change the climate policy and climate agenda. It may maybe break it a bit in terms of pace, but I think this is something what is going to continue. Then how much the business will change because of this many possibilities to do now online instead of physically being present. It will have an impact, but I guess it will still be incremental, not a fundamental change. And I guess there is a big upside is the entire healthcare innovation space. If we talk about also genomics and other related disciplines. I think this is where we have a big upside, also taking into account the aging population. And finally, what kind of EU we'll see? Again, I think the last financial crisis, even though it made many deep scars, I think it also cemented some of features, and I think euro area as such is certainly far stronger and is helping. Of course, the north-south divide continues to be there. I think it's difficult to breach, but perhaps we need a bit more time and to see how to get out of it. ECB support is there. I think EIB, European Investment Bank, is there. I think the money is plentiful. I mean, if you look also what the governments are doing, so that is kind of the least of my concern, or it's concern to a different direction, that this money is not going to be wasted on the companies who actually do not have a long-term perspective. And we still have a Brexit, sort of what we have, but perhaps a bit forgotten over the corona crisis. So there are many things still moving, and let's see how we get out of it. But again, last century I think was much more disruptive with 2 world wars, Great Depression, and we still survived. So we will going to survive this crisis too. So thank you. I will stop here.
Thanks so much, Andres. I wanted to say also that since we have quite a lot of participants here, everybody who is listening to this is welcome to submit questions in a Q&A section. I already see that we have got some there. In addition, I launched a small, completely unscientific survey or poll reflecting some of the themes that were presented in those presentations. You can also answer that. Particularly when you're unhappy with the questions or unhappy with the options in this multiple choice questionnaire, you're welcome to ask open-ended questions in the Q&A section, and you can also post open-ended answers there if you were not able to do that because of the limited design of this questionnaire. So please do that. So and we can move to the discussion. And first, I would like to go back to our first 2 presenters and maybe start with Parag, if you don't mind. And maybe you could reflect on some of the things that were said by Merle, Andres, and Risto. And, you know, again, like it's relatively open-ended, but for me, what was interesting is that you mentioned that Europe will be pivotal in this new sort of Afro-Eurasia architecture. But Europe at the same time also has sort of, it seems a little bit like limited capacity. Andres mentioned, you know, the depth issues. Also, you know, the leadership is relatively fragmented. We don't have one sort of strong leader who's really heading us here. Sometimes it's unclear who's in charge of what. We were kind of slow on a European level also to respond to the crisis, some of the things that Andres mentioned. And finally, maybe that is interesting to me is that, you know, if we have this sort of new world of Afro-Eurasia, what kind of security architecture we would have there, you know, without, you know, US engagement? I think that would be an interesting question as well. So please, floor is yours. It's relatively open-ended question, as you can see. Yeah.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for all of the presentations. Let me say a couple of things. The wonderful thing about scenarios is that they don't have to be mutually exclusive stories, you know, and I find that even obviously within Risto's scenarios and others, there is a degree of fluidity. One can lead to the other precisely as he mapped out. And even if you imagine all of them to some degree coexisting, you can have a Belt and Road world as well as a world of nationalism among many parties in the world, and also have parts of the world excluded from that system where people are still living like hunter-gatherers and have Chinese technology being the dominant force. You can imagine a very real world outcome in which strong elements of all 4 become reality. So it's always important to mention that scenarios are never, or very, very rarely mutually exclusive. And in that spirit, I saw lots of overlap, obviously, in the things that we were saying. So, for example, by no means is fragmentation excluded from my scenario, certainly when it comes to Europe. One can still aggregate European data, however, obviously, in terms of Europe's total trade volumes and so forth. Of course, Germany exports more to China than Spain exports to China. But at the end of the day, we're looking at the fact that European interests in terms of expanding their ties economically or commercially with Asia are obviously a logical interest that continues even if you have a multi-speed, multi-level, even a somewhat fragmented Europe. So with Europe, obviously, none of us can say for sure whether or not you're going to have a fiscal union, follow a monetary union, and that kind of thing. We just don't know. We do know that Europe as a whole, is basically, with most countries, large economies, have incrementally realized that they need to be more like Germany in a way, in the sense that they need to focus on exporting more. And again, this was happening prior to the pandemic. Given the crisis right now, there's no logical conclusion but to think that European economies will need even more to attract investment and to try to strengthen their exports. Now, on the Afro-Eurasian point, I also certainly did not mean to exclude in any way the potential role of the US. So, immediately following the Afro-Eurasia slide, I said we have this world of regional clusters, and each of them or players within them is seeking to be a utilities provider in the geopolitical marketplace to the others. So America still wants to be influential in Africa. It still wants to be influential in the Middle East. It still wants to be influential in South America. It certainly still wants to be very influential in Asia. And all of the above, right? The US is trying to remain as connected. The American or North American circle is trying to be as connected to the others as possible. The Federal Reserve has enabled an expanded line of credit, obviously, to many central banks. The US military continues to tie up certain strategic partnerships. So there does not have to be an architecture, however, to this. Very often, especially in the field of global governance studies, we would like there to be an architecture. We would like there to be a rational design. But we have spent the last 30 years collectively ensuring that there is no such thing. It is our collective action or lack of collective action that has led to a degeneration of the post-war institutions. And the only two that are left that actually matter, unless I'm missing one that's staggeringly important, are the World Trade Organization and the IMF. And the IMF obviously has had a rocky ride the last say 15 plus years, but overnight it became instantaneously very, very relevant again. The largest IMF program in the entire Asian region prior to the pandemic was Pakistan. And that was a drop in the bucket compared to the program for Argentina. So, the IMF mattered where it mattered, but that really was in very few places. Fast forward exactly 2 months, and the IMF is by far the most systemically relevant international institution in the world. It has $1 trillion set of lifelines out there, and most of the world's countries have sought emergency lines of credit. So the IMF certainly matters. The World Bank is playing its part too, about $150 billion worth of lending programs and grants and loans and so forth for countries. They're both working on debt relief issues as well for the poorest. So they really matter. The UN Security Council is nowhere to be seen here and doesn't really matter. So global governance is a very uneven thing. It will continue to be. Again, regional governance will matter by and large a lot more than global governance. Again, even with these IMF programs reaching all over the world, the fact is that Asians run their own system here, right? You have the swap lines between central banks, you have the trade agreements, you have their own governance of mobility, cross-border investment regulations and relationships. Asians borrow from what they've learned from the World Trade Organization in particular, right? Their trade agreements build upon the rule book from the WTO, but selectively. But they don't borrow from any other rule book. They don't bother, right? So, we will have much more regional governance than global governance. And again, where the United States or where Europe selectively chooses, and I highlighted, for example, the Quad, which is again the military relationship between the US, India, Australia, and China. That is meant, of course, to maintain, as they say, a free and open Indo-Pacific, which means the Indian Ocean, which actually means the Afro-Eurasian waterways. The maritime dimension of Afro-Eurasia is the one where, in fact, the US-led constellation of countries is the most powerful naval presence. The local powers are, in particular, Japan, Australia, and India, but the US is playing a very important role in bringing them together into this new soft architecture. So there is no formal institutional architecture. There is simply this growing overlapping set of soft arrangements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Parag. Now I would like to give opportunity to Risto, maybe also to reflect on some of the comments by previous speakers. And I think I would particularly be interested in what happens to the euro under the different scenarios. Will the euro be able to deal with those different scenarios, and also perhaps a little bit on sort of distributional impact, in the sense that you work with Finnish businesses. In the presentation, you primarily talked about, on a country level or a regional level, Europe wins and loses and so on. But how about how would different developments, different possible scenarios, how would they impact different sectors? Are there some sectors who might win under some scenarios? Or I assume that you have had some discussion on that with Finnish businesses, and I understand some of the Finnish businesses are heavy users of those scenarios. They actually use them in their sort of strategies and planning all the time. So and of course you can go on and sort of, it's relatively open-ended question to reflect also some of the things that other speakers said. So please, Risto, floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. There's a lot of interesting ideas to comment on, but I'll take your challenge and try and say something about the euro. Personally, and this is a personal view, I see it very difficult to imagine the euro coming out of this intact. I think that it will probably be safe for the time being, because the European Central Bank is pumping more and more money into the system. But when we start the recovery, I think that there will be such a different speed between Southern European and Northern European recovery that the strains that we already saw during the euro crisis are going to be impossible to keep in place. So I think that in my mind at the moment, it's very difficult to see the euro being as it is today in 5 years' time. That's a personal recollection. Now, in terms of scenarios, if we go to the Nike Swoosh scenario where China leads and Europe follows, where these two new empires find each other and cooperate because they are more dependent on foreign trade, as Parag said, than the US and North America is, then I think Europe would be safe. I think also in a V recovery where we would see a rapid recovery, the euro would be safe. But if we see a delayed recovery, U or even sort of L recovery, then euro, I think, is doomed. And that, I think, that goes to the question then I'd like to comment on, which is basically what Merle said about European solidarity and going forward. Traditionally, any crisis has led to a further integration and deepening of integration of the European Union. And now that is a possibility this time as well. However, because of the disparity between Southern Europe and Northern Europe, I have very difficult time imagining a great jump forward in terms of European integration and deepening of that. So I think that the best course for Europe going forward is sort of less is more, concentrating on a couple of issues that we want to take forward together. And that would, in my mind, be better than rushing into a deepening of integration. Then your point as to which sectors are likely to be more successful than others. Yes, the common view is that industry will recover quicker than services. And this is because of the hit has been harder on services. And when there's demand, factories can just restart. But in terms of services, you will see millions of bankruptcies across the world and thousands of them in Finland and Sweden, that sort of thing. So that's the general picture. And of course, the winners are anything having to do with online services or anything of that sort. One final point, I think one dominant technology that's going to come out of this is 3D printing. That's going to get a huge boost as a result of this crisis.
Thank you, Risto. And Merle, perhaps you could also reflect a little bit on some of the issues that have been discussed here. I think like one question that I have that would be interesting sort of discuss in the short term is that you mentioned that the US has turned inward. What about if there is an outcome where that was also described in one of the scenarios by Risto, where Biden will be elected president? Would that mean anything for the sort of security issues? Will there be more sort of US involvement in Europe, less sort of turning inward, or won't there be any sort of significant change in that sense? And another sort of question is that we also had a question here, and obviously I'm also sort of throwing it at you, but others can also ask. It's basically a question about sort of basic state survival. There is a question that whether some states will survive, will be able to survive, won't survive this crisis at all. You know, already some states are quite weak. Sort of, should we see some kind of state collapse? I mean, some of the states already are sort of paper leviathans, if you will. I mean, they don't have very good capacity to control their borders and other things. So, and that could create additional sort of security dilemmas, right? When you would have a collapse of the states, or is that sort of very unlikely scenario? So I'm just sort of reflecting one of the questions that we got in Q&A section. So. But obviously, you can also reflect on other points that others have raised. So please, floor is yours.
Thanks. Taking up on the question of your question on the possibilities of the possible outcomes of the US presidential elections. Well, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. There are some polls taken currently in the US, and these public opinion surveys consistently show that international concerns are among Americans' least worries, that they rather worry about the depth of the recession, and also voters are looking very closely at how President Trump is handling the pandemic, and in this victimhood is a powerful political rallying cry. 8 in 10 Republican registered voters believe that other nations take advantage of the US, unfortunately. So looking at that, we can expect more international attacks on international institutions such as NATO, UN, EU, by almost 2 to 1. That is 47% to 25%. Republicans are more likely than Democrats to say that NATO is more important to other nations than it is to the United States. So yes, indeed, the democratic rhetoric on institutions that are important from the transatlantic security and defense point of view are more favorable. And if Biden would be to be elected, probably the rhetoric would be different.
Would you like to reflect also on state survival or
state survival? It's hard. It's always a very slippery slope to name and shame. I believe states that weren't in a good position to begin with before this crisis are not to be looked with envy. I'm thinking of states where there already is an open security conflict going on, that have to juggle with that on top of now new crisis induced health problems and the later economic recovery. I'm thinking, and these states are various. I mean, starting from Ukraine to all the way to Yemen, for example, the countries that are in difficult position.
Thank you. Andres, maybe you can also, there have been quite a lot of questions asked on finance issues in our Q&A and also chat room. But one of the questions that I have is that you talked about that it's likely that sort of state capitalism will prevail in response to this crisis, and the state will get more involved. But what's the time frame that you're sort of talking about here? Are we talking about 10 years or 15 years? Maybe there might be also sort of backlash, and we're sort of getting back to the other cycle, and as we have had also in the 20th century, that you have been the time periods where you have had sort of stronger state involvement, and then you have time periods where you have a greater liberalization. This is one question, and then we have a bunch of questions from the audience. I guess there was a question about the W-shaped recovery. If you have W-shaped recovery, what would be the implications for different countries? I guess they could emerge at different times, and it would have some kind of distributional effect. Then was a question about the credit bubble that I see that you already sort of answered in the chat room, that how is the international credit bubble going to be resolved? And then we had also a question about basically how this crisis is sort of different from the previous one. I guess the intention in this question was something that in the previous one, the bankers were kind of responsible for not being not so honest, let's put it that way. But now perhaps there will be a quicker recovery, that it's not a it's not a crisis caused by subprime mortgages or some kind of instruments that were crucial in the previous crisis. So maybe, yeah, I mean, maybe you can reflect on some of those questions that I had and we also got from the audience through chat room and Q&A. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. On state capitalism, I think the entry time frame is really clear. I mean, if you look at the support measures in different countries, I mean, these are here and now. I think the big question, and also the degree of state intervention to our normal lives and to the normal business, it's enormous. I think it's kind of, well, I haven't personally, fortunately, never experienced a war, but it's massive disruption in a way how society and businesses operate. So, and the question is then, if there is a state intervention and there is a support, financial support to companies or different kind of regulations, including, for example, on the movement of labor or at one point it could well be also on the movement of capital. So, what is the exit strategy for a state? Because it's oftentimes you see the government entering and then they never leave. I mean, and that I think is a fundamental problem if it is going to stay this way. So I think whenever the state support is granted to any companies, there has to be a clear exit strategy. Otherwise, we are mixing up the things what we shouldn't do. On the W-shaped recovery, I think Risto here already commented. I think at the end it's always a game of survival of the fittest if it goes this way, and again I think in a way, it was good that this pandemic, or in relative terms, good that this pandemic hit us basically at a very high position in the growth cycle. But that also implies that not every company, there would have been a slowdown anyway. The question would have been in the pace and how deep it would have been. But it also means that not all companies and not all industries will continue to function in the same way. So there is always a collateral damage. So and I agree here that sort of sectorally it is probably very different. I mean, for example, if you look at the agriculture for a moment, I mean, they are very well in the business. Or if you look at the food stores and all the consumer essentials, so that I think is very, very uneven. On a credit bubble, but this has been building for a long time, and I think it has been discounted extensively. I mean, it was there basically since when, actually before the last financial crisis, and it has been accelerating since then. And as I said, I mean, to keep the economy growing, you needed increasingly more debt to sustain it, and that is not gonna run forever. So I think some degree of write-offs or write-downs is unavoidable, and that means some companies go bust. Inflation, yes, I think it would be kind of convenient, at least people think that in history it was convenient, but I mean, what you do in reality, you still reduce the real purchasing power of people. So if people are smart, and sometimes they are, maybe oftentimes they are, so they discover that actually somebody has taken money away from them. And on top, if interests go up, many of private and public debt burdens will become instantly unsustainable. So it's not going to be easy. So some degree of write-down, and then I think what is going to happen is a very low growth period for extended period of time, maybe 10 years. Difference from previous crisis, I mean, we don't see today, at least not in the banking, but there are other segments. If you look at the fund industry, insurers, pension funds, I mean, somebody is holding these assets which need to be deflated. So I think it's a different in nature, and also it's not a demand-driven shock. It's also equally supply-driven. That you just, I mean, billions of people have been put sitting at home. And also the business is not functioning as it used to be. So it is a big crisis, and multifold crisis on the health front, and on the economy, and also I think sort of on the human side, psychologically. I mean, our lives have been disrupted massively. I mean, it's in Estonia, it's only 6 weeks, I think, but people already feel that this is not going to be something what we really want to tolerate. And I will add one more point on whether euro as a currency will survive. I think these are the questions what always pop up in these difficult situations, as we did back in 2008, 9, and until 2012. For me, euro is much more than just a currency. It's part of a political project, and again, it's a big logistical and technical exercise to introduce euro. But if you want to exit, I don't imagine how you can do it in practice. Then sort of things will break up, and I think end of a euro will be end of a union. That's my very simple take on it. With that positive note, I will stop. So better keep euro and keep the union.
All right, thank you very much. I'm also going to give an overview of this brief survey we did among the participants, and we have actually a very good response rate. About 81% of the people participated. So this is really good. On the first question, will regionalization displace globalization? about 76% of those who answered think that they will coexist, and 17% say yes, and 11 say no. Then we had a question about anti-China backlash that comes from Parag's slides, and 60% of those people answered agree that there will be deepening of anti-China backlash. 16 say no, and 30% say it depends. And what kind of world order will emerge in the next 15 years? So about 62% of the people believe that it will be sort of regional bloc-based, and we have sort of scattered geopolitics. And 22% of the people believe that it will be kind of global cooperation with dominant states, and the third most popular, actually the second most popular, is networks, kind of less state-driven, but more all kind of different actors will be involved. And other sort of options got less support among the participants. And on economic recovery, actually the answers are distributed evenly between U-shaped recovery and W-shaped recovery. Both get 30%. V-shaped recovery gets 14%, L-shaped 6%, and something else gets 19%. So those are the sort of crowdsourcing results. I will also share it with everybody who participated. I just did it now. Since our time is up, I would like to thank all the panelists. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for your insights. I found it very useful. Obviously, it's important for our project, but even more importantly, it's important for everybody who's thinking about where the world is going, what kind of decisions they should make, and what kind of scenarios we may have to deal with in the future. So again, thanks very much, and I hope to see you around. Hope to do other webinars. And also thank the Foresight Center for supporting this project. And have a good afternoon, have a good evening. And then some of our listeners are maybe in different time zones where it's still a morning, so have a good morning. So see you around. Thanks. All the best.
Thank you.